In the studio today, I have Andy in this first episode in a series of podcasts regarding alcoholism. Welcome, Andy.
Hi, George. How are you?
Fantastic. We have a topic for this podcast, the dry drunk, untreated alcoholism. And that sounds very serious.
Well, it certainly was serious, George. I almost died several times after I put down the alcohol. It was the most horrendous experience of my life to live life without alcohol, but without any kind of tangible solution to treat my alcoholism.
And you have been a member of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, with 37 years in the program. That's quite fantastic.
Yes, I came in 1984 originally.
And you have a long history of relapse as well. And relapse means what?
Relapse is when sobriety becomes so painful and so unmanageable and so chaotic that you get to a place where you have no mental defense against picking up the next drink. And I did that for my first 13 years of going to meetings. I relapsed periodically, literally for more than a decade in AA.
So 37 years in the program and now 22 years sober.
Exactly. I am now 22 years sober.
Okay. So what happened when you first came into AA and put down the alcohol? Why did you suddenly stop drinking? Did you see that you had a serious problem?
Well, I stopped drinking because I recently got married to a lovely Norwegian girl. And I did love her very much, but my behavior when I was drunk was so destructive that I was afraid that I would lose the marriage if I didn't do something about my drinking. Yeah.
And that was the turning point.
That was the turning point. I realized I've got to do something about my drinking, otherwise my wife would walk away from me, and I didn't want that.
How was your mental and emotional state at that time?
When I stopped drinking or before I stopped drinking?
When you stopped?
When I stopped drinking, when I first stopped drinking, initially I was quite relieved to have stopped drinking, and I was really happy to have found the support group of the meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was very happy about that. But then as reality began to set in, I suddenly realized that life without drink was actually very, very difficult. And I understood why I drank when I stopped.
Some people can drink and they can manage their lives. But some people has something called alcoholism. And alcoholism is, according to Wikipedia, the most serious form of problem drinking and describes a strong, often uncontrollable desire to drink. Sufferers of alcoholism will often place drinking above all other obligations, including work and family, and may build up physical tolerance or experience withdrawal symptoms if they stop.
Exactly. And I have to say at this point that I started drinking at the age of 13, and I don't think that I ever had a social drink. I drank for effect from my very first drink, and I needed the effect because I felt so uncomfortable within myself. I had a very difficult upbringing. I was adopted in a fairly negative environment, and so I was angry. I was very insecure. I couldn't cope with any type of social interaction. So I started to drink alcohol as a social lubricant, but not only that, as a way of helping me to cope with my feelings and to cope with the reality that I found intolerable as a young man.
How much did you drink?
I as much as it took to get absolutely paralytically drunk. Yeah, I can't remember how much.
Was it a bottle of vodka or 10 beers?
No. It was cheap sherry initially. It was cans of super strong lager, which you could buy in England, where I'm from. There was a beer called Special Brew, which is about 13.5% proof.
And that did the trick.
And 4 or 5 cans of that, and I was absolutely paralytic.
So life was in tumble.
Total, I never, because of my drinking, George, I never achieved anything in my life at all. I never developed a career. I never got into a relationship. I never got married. I didn't really have friends. I was something of a loner. My only interest in life was to drink and to take other substances and to get as out of my head as I possibly could.
Did you drink alone a lot?
I drank alone a lot. Yeah, I wasn't a pub drinker. I was a solitary drinker. I used to drink in parks, wherever I could, but on the whole, I drank alone.
You mentioned to me earlier that you went into therapy to deal with mental and emotional state in early sobriety. Can you elaborate and tell us a little bit more?
I was convinced that the reason why I felt so angry and so frightened and bitter and full of resentment and hatred was because I was abandoned by my mother when I was 18 months old, and I grew up in foster care. And my experiences in foster care were quite negative for me. And I didn't get the kind of support and nurture that a child is supposed to get when they're growing up. My foster mother had other children that she was looking after, and she doted on them. And unfortunately, she didn't feel the same way about me. And I was the kind of scapegoat of the family. So when I got sober, I thought that the way that I was going to deal with these issues and begin enjoying my sobriety was to go into therapy. I spent more than 10 years in psychotherapy, going to meetings, and during that time, I have to say, this is just my own experience, therapy not only didn't help me, but it actually made me worse. I became more angry and more bitter, and as a result of that, I couldn't stay sober, and I kept on relapsing and relapsing. So therapy had a very negative effect on me, and I found out much later on when I did the steps with the sponsor why therapy made me worse and not better.
So you went into therapy and also went to a lot of AA meetings.
I was going to daily AA meetings, and I was in therapy, many different types of therapy. And I know that this is going to sound really strange now that I wasn't really drinking, but mentally and emotionally, and as I later discovered spiritually, I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker not drinking.
And the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. Many people assume that AA is some strange sect meeting in secret dark rooms and discuss their problems. People are a little bit confused about AA, aren't they?
Well, I came to AA. I liked AA from my very first meeting because I finally found myself in the company of people that I could relate to, and they could relate to me. So in some ways, coming to AA was like a homecoming for me. I always felt alone, alienated and isolated in the world. But when I went to my first AA meeting, suddenly people were talking about how I felt my entire life. Later on, I began to have quite a serious problem with what I saw as the religious aspect of AA. Mm. And that's a whole other topic.
We come into that. So AA helped you with friendship, with the community thing, helping each other, honestly sharing about problems. Can you tell us a little bit short about that?
Well, I stayed sober initially on the fellowship aspect of meetings. I made friends, I did make friends, but I tried to resolve my inner issues in therapy, but as I said, it didn't work. And my head was absolutely exploding with resentment about my childhood and to all the people that I thought that had harmed me. I was full of resentment. So sobriety was very, very difficult for me to manage.
You showed me AA's big book here, and we're looking at it now. And it mentions God, 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 God on every page. How could people want to have help go into an AA program if they don't believe in God?
Well, I do actually identify myself as an agnostic in AA, and I had an enormous problem with the God word when I first came to AA. I thought that AA was some kind of a quasi-religion or a religious cult. And
So it's not?
It's not. It's a spiritual, not religious program. And it was very important for me to learn the difference between religious and spiritual. So I saw the steps, the 12 steps on the wall of meetings in AA, and I read the steps, and the steps were presented as a plan of recovery from the alcoholic illness, the mental, physical, and spiritual part of the alcoholic illness. And in 6 of the 12 steps, the word God word is mentioned. And I was so daunted by the God word and so prejudiced about the God word because I was raised in a very strict Roman Catholic boarding school, and I had a lot of resentments towards the priests who used to beat me, and so I couldn't handle the God word at all. So I used that as an excuse not to do the steps in AA at all. And as a result of that, I sadly relapsed for as long as I did.
So if you don't do the steps, if you don't go to meetings, it's a high risk of relapse. Is that what you're saying?
I think in my case it was guaranteed. I couldn't stay sober without working some type of an AA program.
Your attitude to the God word and a higher power that AAS was telling you was that your recovery was dependent on that.
It was dependent on that, and I was very fortunate to find a sponsor that was able to help me find a practical definition of a higher power. In AA, they kept on talking about you have to get a higher power to deal with your powerlessness over alcohol. And I didn't understand what that meant. To me, a higher power meant God. And so I couldn't relate to that. But then I got a sponsor. So tell us first, a sponsor. What is a sponsor in AA? A sponsor is a member of AA that has been happily sober for some time, and they have gone through the steps with their sponsor, and they make themselves available to take newcomers through the program. It's a program of service to others, yeah? The whole principle of AA is based on love and service to others. So sponsorship helps the sponsor to maintain his own sobriety by taking a newcomer through the program. Interesting approach. Yeah, it's an altruistic organization based on service. So sponsors maintain their own sobriety by helping others to go through the steps. So your cynical attitude about the idea that your alcoholism required a spiritual solution, that growed on you, or that was the only way for you to do it? Or? I had such a lot of prejudice about the whole concept of spirituality as having anything to do with my addiction to alcohol. I couldn't make the connection. I used to say to people, what has my drinking got to do with any type of spiritual emptiness or spiritual bankruptcy? It's a load of nonsense. It's a psychological problem and not a spiritual problem. And then I had to reconsider my attitude after 13 years of relapse. So alcoholism is a spiritual problem? I believe it is. For me today, I believe actually it's a mental problem. Really? It's a mental problem because we have a very, very distorted ways of thinking and perceiving reality, ourselves and the world. But the solution is spiritual, not psychological. And there AA
fills in and help you overcome that.
It did. When I overcame my prejudice about spirituality as a solution to alcoholism, I got a sponsor, and I said to this sponsor, how on earth am I going to overcome my ambivalence and my prejudice towards the God word? And he said, why don't you make AA itself your higher power? It will work for you. The program will work for you if you make AA, the AA program itself and the suggestions that I'm going to give you a power greater than yourself. And that's what I started to do. I had no other choice, really. It was either that or drink myself to death or commit suicide. So I handed my will and my life over to my sponsor, and entered the AA program and started to take the suggestions of AA.
So if you have problems and you don't believe in God, or you have issues with it, you can replace it with something else.
You can.
Tell me.
I replaced the God word with good, orderly direction. God, the very good acronym for God in AA is good, orderly direction. Yeah. Another very helpful acronym for God in AA is group of drunks.
Okay.
And those kinds of things really helped me to find practical higher powers that I could use.
And then you finally received the gift of desperation, as you have said earlier.
Yes.
After 13 years of relapse.
In AA, it's known as a gift. Desperation, when you get to a place where nothing is working, nothing is going to help you stop relapsing or drinking, and you become absolutely desperate, then that in AA is seen as a gift. And it was a gift in my case, because it wasn't until I received that gift and my ego collapsed after 13 years of relapse that I realized that my way didn't work, and it never had worked, and it was unlikely to ever work in the future.
So ego and alcoholism goes hand in hand.
Absolutely. I think that my alcoholism and my maladapted alcoholic ego are very closely related. I had to begin the process of ego deflation in order to recover from the illness. And I discovered that my ego was so destructive and so negative and so selfish and self-centered that I would actually use people, places and things to fill that terrible emptiness inside me. And I was mentally and spiritually, I was getting more and more negative and going more and more into a very dark place.
And you suddenly became teachable because you have a guidance of a sponsor.
I had to become teachable. I was so arrogant and so defiant and so belligerent that all my life as an alcoholic, if anybody told me what to do, I would do the opposite.
Really?
I would just do the opposite. That was a big part of my defiant alcoholic personality. And when I got hammered by my untreated alcoholism, in sobriety, and the stinking thinking, the resentment, the self-pity, the rage, the blame. I blamed everybody for my problems, yeah, especially my childhood. And it got to the point where life became unbearable. My sober life became unbearable. And that is when I surrendered and I became teachable. I asked a sponsor to help me.
Did you take his daily suggestions seriously?
I had to. I had no choice. I had no choice. If I wanted to survive and not destroy myself, I had to begin taking the suggestions seriously. And the suggestions that David, who was my first sponsor, who was a very tough sponsor, but he worked for me because I was so defiant, was to write daily gratitude lists, to pray, believe it or not, even prayer. He suggested that I pray whether I believed in God or not.
So how can you pray if you don't believe in God?
My praying was a demonstration of my surrender over the illness. Whenever I got on my knees, David told me that I was surrendering in front of my powerlessness over my illness, and that it's not true that no one was listening when I was praying, because I was listening. The part of me that wanted to get well was listening. So prayer actually became nothing more than a positive affirmation of my desire to get well.
So your first attempt of going through the steps is 12 steps in the AA program.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I went through the steps with David, and he told me to make AA my higher power. That was first of all, he told me that I needed to admit that I was powerless over alcohol and that my life had become unmanageable. I had 13 years of evidence in AA to tell me that that was correct. So he told me to make AA my higher power. That's step 2. He told me that my step 3 decision was merely a decision not to hand my will and my life over to a God that I didn't believe in, but my step 3 decision was a decision to remain teachable and to go on with the rest of the steps. And then he put me on step 4, and I wrote a very thorough step 4 I listed all my resentments throughout my life and my fears and everything, and I read it out to him in step 5. It took me 3 months to write my step 4. I ended up, believe it or not, with 2,200 resentments in my step 4, and I shared
2,200 resentments?
Yeah. I was so afraid, George, of drinking again that I wanted to be absolutely thorough. And so a lot of the stuff that I wrote down was absolute nonsense. But I was so frightened of drinking again that I wrote everything that I could think of that I ever thought that I could have a resentment about. And I was full of resentment, there's no question about it. I went through life resenting everybody, hating everybody, blaming everybody. I had resentments obviously against myself. My mother, my foster mother, the priests at the boarding school, the psychiatrists, the social workers, the prison officers when I was in prison. I hated everybody. So I came up with 2,200 resentments.
Was it a good feeling to get that out?
It was a good feeling because it helped me to understand that it wasn't everyone else that was the problem. It was me. That I was the architect and the creator of all of these resentments. So it helped me in as much as I had to stop blaming. And a big part of my alcoholism and my dishonesty was that I couldn't stop blaming people that I destroyed my life with alcohol.
And you told me half through the steps, you sort of went into rebellion and decided you needed a woman in your life.
Sometime after my step 5, in classic alcoholic style, which is defiance and rebellion and ego, my ego snapped back and I said, I've done enough of this work on myself. I put in so much effort to my step work. It's time for me to have some fun. And I decided at that time that my idea of fun was to get involved with a woman and have a little fun and a little romance and a little, naughtiness. Yeah. And I sacked David and I said, Arrivederci. And I went off in search of my other half.
You fired your sponsor?
Yeah.
So you're untreated. Okay, so you met that woman, and then it went into bad things.
Actually, if I'm honest, I had 2 fairly long-term relationships after I fired David, and they were the most toxic, destructive relationships that I ever had in my life. And I didn't understand why until much later on. And essentially what happened was that I was still walking around with untreated alcoholism. And
together with or toxic codependency.
Well, that was an extension of my untreated alcoholism.
It's very complicated.
I mean, basically, I was using women and sex in exactly the same way as I'd used alcohol and drugs. There was absolutely no difference. All of my addictive patterns that I had when I was drinking and drugging, I acted out in those two relationships. There was no honesty, there was no genuine love, there was no loyalty. It was all about me using them to fix the emptiness inside of me.
So you're saying that it's very similar, addiction to alcohol is very similar to addiction to drugs and alcohol?
It's more or less, it's a different manifestation of the same illness, which I have come to believe is the spiritual illness, the spiritual emptiness that condemn alcoholics to drink themselves to death.
Alcoholism is described also, or treatment of alcoholism is a way to treat an inner emptiness. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I drank and I took drugs, and every codependent relationship that I ever was in was to try and medicate the inner emptiness that I felt inside of me. I didn't know who I was. I had no sense of self. So that left a huge void within me, an inner emptiness. I call it the hole in the soul where Andy should have been.
Tell us more about that.
I didn't know who I was. There was an emptiness inside of me. I had no relationship with myself. I had no sense of myself. I didn't know Andy at all. I was only introduced to Andy by going through the 12 steps. And Andy gave me a sense of self. And it gave me a feeling of a relationship with myself. And that began to fill the inner emptiness that I'd had ever since I was ever since my childhood.
So you're saying that alcoholism is a disease of perception?
My perception of reality was so distorted by my dishonesty because of my need to drink, take drugs, and engage in many other types of addictive behaviors that I didn't know what honesty was anymore. I was totally committed to using and abusing people, places, and things. I lied, I robbed, I cheated, I manipulated, and so my whole life was a lie. I lived a lie. And that dishonesty that I had inside me compounded even further the inner emptiness that I felt inside. I didn't know how to be honest. And so my perception of reality was completely distorted by my maladapted alcoholic ego.
You call yourself an agnostic. That means you don't really believe in God. You believe in something else, I suppose.
Yes.
And you are now writing a book about it. You already have a website up and running, aaforagnostics.com, and you're writing a book. Why are you writing a book?
I'm writing a book which I've called The 12 Steps for Agnostics. And it's a book about my experiences of recovery and my journey through the 12 steps, which, as I said, mentions God in 6 of the 12 steps as an agnostic. I was able to find sponsors and get the support to go through the program as a non-believer, and it absolutely transformed my life. And I realized that you don't need to believe in God for the 12 steps to transform your life. All you need is a higher power. And as I explained later, AA was my higher power. So it's not that I don't believe in God. I'm not an atheist. I'm an agnostic. So I consider myself to be a spiritual seeker. I'm searching for spiritual solutions to my problems, yeah? And I'm finding them. And I'm still a seeker. And as long as I'm seeking a spiritual solution to my alcoholism, then I believe that I'm very much in the solution. So I'm a seeker more than I am an agnostic.
Okay, you have been 37 years in the program now. How are you feeling, Andy? How is your life now?
Once I had to go through the steps more than once, George. Yeah. My disease of perception was so strong, and my belief that I was a victim. I had a very strong victim belief system. I believed that everybody had destroyed my life when I was a kid growing up, and I had to slowly dismantle that victim belief system by going through the steps. And it was a very miserable way to live, to see yourself as a victim all the time. After several journeys through the steps, all the fear that I lived with my entire life, I used to suffer from very debilitating panic attacks. I was constantly full of fear. I suffered from social anxiety, this depression and emptiness and an unbearable loneliness. It all began to lift. It all began to lift as I, sometime after my 8th step, and then I went on to my 9th step, and that inner emptiness and all the horrible symptoms of untreated alcoholism, which I have called the dry drunk, began to leave me, and I began to experience peace and happiness like I had never known.
What is a dry drunk?
A dry drunk is the untreated spiritual illness of alcoholism. It is ways of trying to fill the inner emptiness through instant gratification. And I was very committed to fill that inner void by seeking instant gratification. And this, of course, made my life chaotic and unmanageable. I was confused, bewildered. I had to deal with all my resentments, which I dealt with in steps 4 and 5. A dry drunk is someone who is Dr. Silkworth, who wrote a foreword to the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, described untreated alcoholism as restless, irritable, and discontented. Without a drink, I was restless, irritable, and discontented all the time. And so that's why I kept on relapsing. And eventually, after going through the steps, I no longer feel restless, irritable, and discontent. I can enjoy my own company. I like being alone. When I was in my early days, I couldn't be alone for 5 minutes. I would start to panic because I couldn't bear the loneliness. And all of that has been healed and filled through the 12 steps. And I didn't need to believe in God for this to happen.
Andy, here's a beer. Would a drink help?
I might as well jump off the roof of a high building than pick up a drink.
Tell us.
Because alcohol for me is absolute poison. If I pick up that first drink, it will trigger off a physical craving and a mental obsession to drink more. And I will start drinking more and more and more. And my alcoholism is so self-destructive, George, that I can't see myself surviving for very long if I drank again.
So what would happen if you took this beer? What would happen with your sobriety in your life? Could you stop after 5-10 beers, or
first of all, I would lose 22 years of sobriety, which for me have become very important, and I feel good about the fact that I'm 22 years sober. In my relapses in the past, whenever I've picked up that first drink, my mindset becomes automatically very dark and very negative, and I become very self-destructive. And so what I would do after picking up that first drink, I would probably go to the store and buy a bottle, and I would go home, and I would probably get a couple of packs of cigarettes, and I haven't had a cigarette for almost 20 years, but if I got a bottle, I'd get 2 packs of cigarettes. I would go home and I would drink myself into absolute oblivion. Where that would end, I cannot say. In my drunken state, I would probably go out, get on in my car or my motorbike and drive, probably in search of a woman. which I would believe would also fix me. So I would be blind drunk. I would get behind the wheel of a car or a motorbike. It would be a miracle if I didn't kill myself, and I would go in search of some solace in the arms of a woman. So I don't know how long I would survive doing that, but I suspect not for very long.
Is it true that when you relapse, you are back in exactly the same position where you was in your case several years ago?
I believe that in AA we talk about alcoholism being a progressive illness. They say that alcoholism is progressive, incurable, and fatal. I can only share my own experience with you, but my alcoholism is most definitely progressive. I had long periods of sobriety in that first 13 years. Once I even managed to have 5 years without picking up that first drink. And when I did relapse, it was as if I'd never stopped drinking. My alcoholism was in exactly the same place as it was when I put down my last drink. So mentally, emotionally and spiritually, my disease is progressing all the time, even in sobriety. So can you imagine what would happen to me if I drank again after 22 years? My illness has been progressing inside me for 22 years in my sober time. If I picked up that first drink, it was as if I'd never stopped. I don't think that I would live for very long. I really don't, based on the experience of my former relapses.
So suppose you're now sitting in a restaurant, you're having a meal and you're thinking, I would like to have a beer and a few gin tonic. What do you do then? Is there any help? Because you don't have an AA meeting just there at that point. What are you doing if you say, I need that drink?
I don't need it anymore, George. I don't need that drink anymore. The steps and the program have placed me in a position of neutrality regarding alcohol. I don't need it. I don't crave it. If I ever got very upset, which was a former relapse trigger for me, if I got very angry or very upset with someone, and I was seriously thinking that a drink would make me feel better, I would pick up the phone and call another member. In AA, we have a slogan, pick up the phone before you pick up the first drink. And that's what I've learned to do. If I'm angry, upset, I talk to another member of AA, and I usually am able to talk my way through it rather than reaching for the instant solution of alcohol.
So there's an option then to call another member or your sponsor, I suggest?
AA has given me a choice. I have a choice today. And if I remain teachable and exercise what I've learned in AA, I can choose to stay sober no matter what happens. No matter what happens.
Do you believe you can remain sober for the rest of your life?
I'm not arrogant enough to say that, yeah. In AA we talk about just for today. It's a slogan that AA is well known for, one day at a time. I believe that I'm sober today, and provided that I remain teachable and go to AA meetings and keep in regular contact with my sponsor and do the step work and do my meditation and do other spiritual practices, I have a choice. I don't need to pick up that first drink.
Many people, young and old, in all walks of life, may be thinking, I have a little problem with my alcohol, but I can't stand that God word. So here is now something new coming.
Well, this book that I'm going to publish in a few months' time, hopefully, will demystify the God word in AA. I'm here to tell you that you do not need to believe in God or the traditional idea of God for the AA program to work for you. It works just fine if you make AA your higher power and the suggestions of your sponsor a higher power, a power greater than you. I have got a life beyond my wildest dreams today, and I believe that I have had a non-God-centered spiritual awakening.
So it is possible to get sober, get a sponsor, go through the AA program without a belief in God.
I believe that because I'm living proof of that. I still don't know what God is. I still struggle with the traditional concept of a monotheistic God. I don't believe in that. I don't think that I will ever believe in that. But my spirituality has gone off in a different direction. And it's really working for me.
I'm looking at your website here now again, aaforagnostics.com, aaforagnostics.com. And here you can fill in your email address and you can get information and the little email when the book is published.
Yes, you can subscribe to my website. My email is there. It's aaforagnostics@gmail.com. I would be happy to keep people informed about the progress of the book. I'm going through the editing process right now, so it should be published on Amazon within 6 months. I would say not more than 6 months. And if you want to do something about your drinking or drugging for that matter, but you're daunted by the God word in AA, I encourage you to have a look at my book. It will offer you solutions that you may not have found, a way to recover without having to depend or rely on a belief in the traditional idea of God.
Thank you, Andy, for coming to see us here and do this interview. Very interesting. And your book will be published in Q3 or maybe Q4 in 2021.
Thank you, George.
And the website address again, aaforagnostics.com. Thank you, Andy, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for having me, George.